Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Hello and welcome to the London part of the show. I'm Amol Rajan. I'm joined for the duration by Chris Philp, the Conservative MP for Croydon South, and by Neil Coyle, Labour MP for Bermondsey and Old Southwark. Coming up later, did you know that once a year you can go into your local council and look at the accounts? We caught up with some armchair auditors who did just that in Lambeth and found out what they discovered. But I want to start, gentlemen, by getting your take on the latest developments with Grenfell Tower and what's happened there. Neil, earlier this morning, Andrew Marr spoke to John McDonnell about his use of the phrase social murder to describe what happened in the tower, and Andrew Neil has just been speaking to Rebecca Long-Bailey about that. Would you say that term is fair to describe what happened?
I think that there are families who are still in shock over what's happened. There were clearly faults in the materials that were used. So there is people must and will be held responsible for what has happened, and we must look at the building regulations and make sure that find a way to make sure that this can never happen again.
But is that kind of hugely evocative language helpful when trying to come to conclusions about how to proceed? If
it results in the government taking the action it has so far failed to do in funding the retrofitting of sprinklers in tower blocks like those in Southwark, there are multiple tall buildings in Southwark where people are more nervous now as a result of what's happened at Grenfell and would like to see their homes made safer and would like the government to commit to doing that. So it's shining light on a very important issue that is affecting thousands of families across our country.
Do you know which thinker of the left popularised the term social murder? Friedrich Engels. Do you think the fact that Rebecca Long-Bailey and John McDonnell are using that kind of language suggests that they occupy a wing of the Labour Party that uses a kind of rhetoric that you're not comfortable with?
They're using the most strident language because they are focused on the families who wish to know that their lost loved ones that will not go unpunished, but also they're representing those thousands of families, millions of people across our country who are more nervous about their homes, don't see sufficient action from the government, are worried that building regulations have been abused or ignored for years, and are worried about their homes.
Chris, do you think that kind of language is the right sort of language to be using?
No, I really don't think it is. If we want to look after the victims of this terrible fire, and if we want to make sure this never ever happens again, because quite clearly this should never have happened in 21st century Britain, we must make sure it never ever happens again. The way we do that isn't by using inflammatory words like social murder. The way we do that is by having a full and proper investigation and wait and see what happens after that. Now, there's a police investigation going on, so if anyone is guilty of manslaughter or murder, that will be found out in due course. We need to make sure the inquiry, well, it's kicked off already, produces an early interim report so lessons learned can happen quickly rather than after a year or two. That's the way we make sure it never happens again. That's the way we take care of families, not trying to sort of score some cheap political point like John McDonnell is. So I call on everyone in politics and in public life to get behind the inquiries and then make sure whatever they find, we take action. And if there is any sort of criminal liability like manslaughter or murder, then the police will find that out, and the people or organisations responsible will get hold to account.
But that wait and see point just isn't good enough for those who are desperate to feel more secure in their own homes. If you're living on the 22nd floor and you're nervous that the government isn't committing the funding to retrofit sprinklers, as has been recommended in the past, that's the issue that can be resolved aside from...
Well, hang on a sec.
aside from the investigation, the longer inquiry into Grenfell
But Neil,
itself.
I'm not saying doing nothing. And of course, within a matter of a few days of that terrible fire, the research establishment started testing hundreds of samples, and in some cases, the Chalcott's estate in Camden near Swiss Cottage, evacuations took place as a result. So of course we need instant action. I completely accept that.
When will the government commit the funding to retrofit the sprinklers?
Actually, Damien Green answered that question. Well, you're not waiting, because Damien Green answered the question in the House of Commons last week. He said that where fire services said that retrofitted sprinklers were required, and if the local authorities didn't have the money to do it, then the government would help out. I mean, Croydon are retrofitting. There are 230 towers in Birmingham getting retrofitted. So the government has said if the council can't afford to do essential work, the government will step in and help. Lack of money is not going to stop us making these places safe.
The question for you, Neil, is whether or not clearly you want action to be taken, and lots of people do, and the government has taken some action. Chris would say the same thing. Is this kind of rhetoric actually useful in addressing the underlying problems, or does it get in the way? Because there are lots of people who say, you know what we need now is calm and a measured response, and calling this sort of horrific tragedy a social murder doesn't help at all.
I'll be honest, it's not language I would use, but if it results in people getting the security they feel they need to carry on living in the homes that they have, then that is the most important part of this. And the idea that, you know, there's going to be this fair assessment of council resources to retrofit by a government that's cut councils' budgets by 40%, including my own Southwark, is it worries me. We need that money up front and not some fake assessment of.
But it hasn't been cut by 40% when you factor in the business rate retention. So this 40% cut figure is not a real figure.
I can see that you two are going to get on. This is fantastic. Well, and we're going to be coming back to Grenfell on this show many times, I'm sure. Thank you both very much indeed for now. Now, the capital is now seeing more than one acid attack every day, causing life-changing injuries to its victims. The increases in attacks has led to its rise up the political agenda. And today, the Home Secretary called for life sentences for acid attackers and a review of existing legislation. And tomorrow, MPs will debate what can be done to tackle the issue. There are some flashing images at the beginning of Raphael Sheridan's report.
On Thursday, Londoners were shocked by a spate of acid attacks, 5 in the space of 90 minutes. 2 teenage males have since been arrested. It's a rising phenomenon in the capital. There were over 450 victims last year, according to Met figures, double the number in 2015, and it's especially prolific in East London. Once almost solely associated with so-called honour violence, it's becoming increasingly widespread as criminal gangs are thought to be switching from knives to acid. It's easier to buy and not a crime to carry. East Ham MP Stephen Timms is clear about what he wants to see happen.
I'd like the Minister to confirm on Monday that the possession of acid will be an offence in the future in exactly the same way that possession of a knife is an offence today. I'd like the law to be changed so that sulphuric acid will only be sold to people who hold a licence.
He will be leading a debate about this in Parliament tomorrow, in light of today's comments from the Home Secretary, who's warned future attackers they face life behind bars. Many Londoners will no doubt be anxious to see what MPs can do to curb this worrying trend.
Raphael Sheridan reporting there. Now, I'm joined by Rabina Khan, who is an independent councillor on Tower Hamlets Council and who has written at length on this subject. Rabina, thank you very much indeed for coming in. Why are these acid attacks so sharply rising?
I think we need to put some context into this. Acid attacks have been prevalent in this country. They happen across the world as well, and they disproportionately impact on women. And for example, research has shown in the last 10 years, hospital admissions have doubled because of acid attacks. And so whilst we're having this debate and the call for legislation, why so late in the day? Why? I mean, these are the questions that need to be asked.
But they have massively increased, which is the question I'm asking you. I mean, whether you go by financial years or not, you know, 2016-17, 398 as against 317 the year before. Some people would say in 2016, 452 attacks, which is more than double the year before. So they are rising sharply, aren't they? Are
they rising, or are we having better resources for people reporting it as well? There definitely has been a spike in the increase of acid attacks. But what I want to talk about is the underreporting. Sure. About many victims who feel that they might face reprisals. I'm dealing with a case with a woman and her son in Tower Hamlets who faced an acid attack back in November 2016. They don't want to come onto the media because they are afraid of reprisals. So we do need the support for victims to have the ability and the support to report.
There is something of a narrative in parts of the media that this is a problem which is particularly prevalent in the South Asian community, parts of the South Asian community, and that it's associated with honour, retribution, if you like, that women are attacked because they've behaved dishonourably. Now, for people who find that kind of thinking absolutely disgusting and don't understand it, just what would be the thinking behind it in those parts of our communities?
In Bangladesh, there is over about 3,500 acid attacks that have taken place. It happens in India, it happens in Afghanistan, it happens in this country. And I go back to my original point that this has been in Britain for a long time. And the fact that we are now having this debate, the fact that we're trying to change legislation, acid attacks are prevalent in certain communities, and there is an agenda behind it. It's the agenda of, it's a terrorism agenda, trying to control a woman in that way. But the new context to acid attacks is that the dimensions and the debate around it has changed. We have now gang members who think it's easier to carry a weapon of choice, which is acid. It's easier to carry the acid than knife because it is an offensive crime if you carry a knife.
Which comes to the point about legislation. Of course, it's easier to disguise acid, of course, because you can carry it around in a bottle. Chris Philp, just picking up on what Rubina says, why has it taken until now for there to be this debate about the legislation needed to counter this sharply rising number of attacks?
Well, as you've said, it's doubled in the last 4 years, so there's been a huge recent increase, which has clearly prompted the debate we're now having. Of course, I mean, injuring someone with acid is already a criminal offence. You can get up to a life sentence for an acid attack already, and carrying acid with intent carries a sentence of up to 4 years under current law. But I must say, I rather agree with everything Stephen Timms said in your clip just now, and with the point we just heard. Effectively, acid is being used as a weapon, like a knife, and in my view, it should be treated as equivalent. So merely carrying the worst kinds of acid, so sulfuric acid and hydrochloric acid, I think there is, excuse me, a very good case for making simply carrying that in public an offence in itself, as is the case with a knife already.
But it's a criminal offence to carry acid with intent, but you don't need a licence to buy acid.
That's right.
So should you need a licence to buy acid?
Well, I think for the most powerful forms of acid, like sulfuric and hydrochloric, I think there is a very strong case for doing that, and we're going to debate it in Parliament tomorrow, because you can't say that you need hydrochloric or sulfuric acid around the home. I mean, it's an industrial chemical, so I think we do need to look at that again, absolutely.
Neil Coyle, will you be in Parliament for this debate tomorrow?
Well, yes, and the bit that concerns me is that whether the law's changed, which I would welcome, is whether the police have the resources to do it. So this tie was actually a gift to me from the mother of a 15-year-old murdered in a knife attack. And we're seeing, 80% of knife crimes go unprosecuted. So if we had the same position with acid attacks of 80% of the criminals going unpunished, then we're not solving anything by just changing the law.
But why is there no sentencing guideline for acid in Britain? I mean, doesn't it strike you as bizarre that we can have guidelines for knife attacks, but we don't have any at all for acid attacks, while, as Rubina's been arguing, they've been rising very sharply in recent years? Well,
it needs to move up the agenda, obviously, and it hasn't moved fast enough for many of those people affected. The other link here is, of course, the gangs who are using it. So the recent spate in North London was around moped crime, so people actually stealing mopeds by using acid on the moped driver, and then using their moped to commit other crimes, in particular mobile phone thefts. And the police tell me they don't have the means to tackle all the moped. There's 2,500 moped, thefts of mobile phones in the last month. So the police don't have the resources to tackle that, and they're told they shouldn't be chasing some moped drivers because of the road. So there are lots of other issues linked into this.
Rubina, isn't there a danger that if there is new legislation and if there is a demand that licences are required for the carrying of acid, that actually people will just end up buying acid online instead?
I mean, we need the regulations in place. We need to make sure we can monitor who's purchasing it. To buy a concentrated litre of acid, it is actually cheaper than buying a 9mm mascara. How many people know that? It's very easy for young people to access, or certain members of our communities to access acid, sulfuric acid as well. My problem here is, while we are having the debate of changing the legislation, we're not talking about supporting the victims here and supporting
Well, how would you like us
police.
to support the victims in a way we're not doing at the moment?
Well, the intent behind using acid isn't about the intent to kill. It is to inflict humiliation, to inflict life-changing...
permanent humiliation.
That's right. So when acid is used, it often melts the face, it melts the skin. The damage that it's caused to a human being is, it's very long-term. Katie Piper, whose face was rebuilt by Dr. Mohammed Jawal, he has often commented that actually the acid attacks are used to inflict a painful sense of humiliation on the self, the identity. So the psychological support, the social support, the physical support needs to be in place for victims. Some victims have had to endure 20 operations to be able to even breathe, to be able to come out in society.
And has the Home Secretary Amber Rudd got it right when she said today that we should be looking at life sentences for acid attacks?
I think she needs to go further, and the reason why she needs to go further, the Home Office do not collect data on acid. The police collect data on acid. The police need to be supported, and the support organisations who support victims of acid and survivors of acid attack also need to be supported.
Chris Philp, final word on that?
Well, I think this is a terribly, terribly important issue. It ruins people's lives. It's deeply disturbing. It's on the rise, and we do need to take urgent action to halt it. And I'm right behind the review that's taking place tomorrow.
Stephen Timms' case. Robina, thank you very much indeed for coming in. Now, depending on who you want to believe, councils are either cesspits of waste or cash-strapped victims of austerity. But thanks to new powers, you, the public, can now find out how the council are really spending your money. Since 2015, town halls have had to open up their accounts to the public for 30 days every year. But in Lambeth, one group's attempts to use those powers is proving highly controversial, as Andrew Cryan now reports.
We went and spoke to that resident and said, can you remember that repair being done?
Meet the armchair auditors, Lambeth citizens armed with a spreadsheet and determined to shake things up at the town hall.
It was really started as a result of, I live next door to this estate, and there was talk about it potentially being demolished because it was too expensive to repair. I read about this piece of legislation via a book called The Silent State by Heather Brooke, which allows people to audit their accounts, and decided to give it a go, really.
So Simon decided to rally the troops, people like Tom here, who lives on the estate.
Notified Lambeth of the issues. They still haven't addressed them. And that was in 2013, 2014.
The result was a document they call the Lambeth People's Audit, which they allege has uncovered financial mismanagement costing millions of pounds. Much of their work focuses on housing and repairs.
So just now the People's Audit wanted to show us around the estate, show us some of the issues that there have been with repairs, with drain pipes, where there'd been a fire risk, that sort of thing. Unfortunately though, someone from Lambeth Council stopped us and asked us to stop filming. They said the estate regeneration is so sensitive that television cameras aren't allowed to film at all.
So instead, here are some photos that they took earlier. One main claim in the People's Audit was that the council took £1 million from the pot of money ring-fenced for council housing, and rather than investing in repairs, they spent it on doing up the town hall. But the council say that's, in their words, fake news, as the money is paying for town hall staff who work on housing.
If you had a housing office on an estate, you would expect for that to be paid for from the HRA because it's part of the housing service. If you put those people in another building that they're sharing with other people, obviously the costs are going to go down a bit, but you'd still expect that to be paid from the HRA.
In fact, the council say the Lambeth People's Audit is not quite what it claims.
This is a political campaign. It's being presented as something else, which is really a shame, because I do think the legislation, which lets people go in, look at council's accounts, see exactly how the council is spending their money, is a really good thing. But in this instance, I'm afraid it's been hijacked by professional politicians who, until very recently, were hiding behind other people. Now, I think there are questions to be asked about why they have released this at all.
So, we put Lambeth Council's words to the People's Audit.
The People's Audit is a collection of senior politicians from the Liberal Democrats and the Greens.
That's laughable. I've never been a member of a political party in my life. Don't particularly have an intention of joining one.
Some of the members are actively involved in politics, and they took us to meet them. This is George Turner, former Lib Dem parliamentary candidate in the borough.
There's people involved who are from the Green Party, people who are involved who aren't a member of any party at all, and I think there might even be a few Labour Party members. I mean, I don't even know what the party affiliation of half of the people involved in the group are, because it's not a concern to us.
Chris Holt has worked for the Greens.
It's all very well for Lambeth Labour to attack the people asking these questions. We just want them to answer the questions. Doesn't matter who's asking them, just answer the questions, and hopefully we can all be satisfied.
But to avoid misunderstanding, does there need to be more transparency on behalf of the new armchair auditors, as well as the local councils?
It's really important, though, that we know who's doing this sort of work, that they're as transparent as they're demanding of the local authority, and that there are clear parameters about how they present their information so that people can make sensible comparisons.
Under the new rules, every council has to open up their books for 30 days. Most London local authorities do it in the summer. So, if you fancy joining the ranks of the armchair auditors, now is probably a good time to look.
Andrew Cryan reporting there. Neil Coyle, you're MP for a constituency right next to Lambeth. Would you welcome this shimmer example of the big society in action?
Well, you know, on the back of this, I was talking to Southwark Council about what they do, and actually a lot of the information is provided. I do think that there are areas where transparency needs to be greater. So, in particular, leaseholder charges for major works programmes is something that continually comes up for concern, as is around planning law and how communities are engaged and some of the information that's shared, some of which has to be changed at national level rather than council.
But is the principle of opening up your accounts to the people, to the citizens for 30 days, a good one because you believe in transparency, or is it a potentially dangerous one because it'll end up getting captured by, you know, front organisations and other political forces?
Well, I mean, where there are legitimate questions about how councils or any public body spend money, then there shouldn't be any problem in opening up the accounts and making sure they're properly considered, whether that's by an alternative political party. I think in Lambeth it's unfortunate that it does seem to be, you know, political opponents of the current council that are leading part of the audit. Actually, as I said,
I mean, that's contested. It's worth saying that there's a lot of...
well, I'm just saying it's unfortunate it does seem to be seen through a political prism there, when actually it should be, if we just looked at this through what needs to be in the public domain, what should be more transparent routinely, not just for 30 days in the summer, but routinely made available.
But Chris Felt, what's the point of this sort of legislation? If you open up to a People's Audit, the People's Audit reports, there's controversy over whether or not they're a political front organisation, that's, you know, the jury's out on that, but then nothing really happens. The council come back and say, you know what, we don't accept your conclusions, and that's that.
Well, I think it's a brilliant initiative. I think openness and transparency are it's the beating heartbeat of our democracy. And what those guys have done in Lambeth, who do appear to be mostly independent, although with a few political activists as well, it's fantastic. And I've got to say, I'm going to be encouraging people in Croydon to do exactly the same thing starting now. Now, in terms of follow-up action you mentioned, there's a number of things. Clearly, the National Audit Office does have overall responsibility for local government audit. So if the National Audit Office sees anything in this report, and I would urge them to read it, they should follow it up. But there's the biggest element of accountability of all coming in May next year, which are the local council elections. And if the people of Lambeth read that report and decide their council has done a bad job, I mean, paying for repairs that were never done, paying twice as much as they should have done for repairs, losing control of their budgets, spending money on the town hall instead of on tenants, they've got an opportunity to kick out the council next May, and I would, you know, that's the ultimate sanction we have in a democracy, the ballot box.
I think that, you know, it's very easy to get into council bashing, especially if you're part of an administrative team, Lib Dems and the Tories, who've cut council budgets so mercilessly over the last 7 years. Because I think councils are actually having to be much more focused on how they spend the money, much more innovative in their partnership working as a result of some of that. But actually, fundamentally, councils do not have the resources to deliver the services.
But Neil said a few minutes ago, earlier in the programme, that the budgets have been cut by 40%. Now, that is not correct, because the business rate retention has replaced that, leaving them, broadly speaking, flat. And councils like Lambeth, and indeed Southwark and Croydon, shouldn't be complaining about council funding when they're paying for repairs that have never even been carried out.
Very, very briefly, gentlemen, because we're very nearly out of time. Neil Coyle, was it a good idea to scrap the Audit Commission in 2011 and to make councils like Lambeth audited by independent private contractors like KPMG?
Well, I think the government's Bomb 5, the Quangos as they called it at the time, was a massive mistake, and we see that across the board, Equality and Human Rights Commission has been equally damaged in how it can do its job. So I think there's been, you know, we'll pay the consequences.
I don't agree. We've got the National Audit Office now overseeing it. Having the National Audit Office and the Audit Commission that cost £200 million a year was wasteful duplication, and I'm glad we streamlined it.
We've got to stop there. We should get you guys on together. You're a fantastic double act. Thank you both very much indeed for coming in. That's all we have time for. My thanks to my guest Neil Coyle and to Chris Philp.